I never thought my life would be measured in memories instead of moments, in silence instead of laughter, in visits to a cold stone instead of walks beside a living hand that once held mine so tightly I believed nothing could ever break us apart. I was only 30 when I first realized that futures are not promised to anyone. People talk about youth like it is endless, like it will always stretch ahead of you like a road under a clear sky. I used to believe that too. I used to think I had time. Time to grow old with him, time to have children, time to argue over small things in the kitchen, time to make up after every fight with laughter that erased everything. But life does not ask for permission before it changes everything. His name was Arslan. Even now, when I say it in my mind, it feels like I am calling someone who might still answer from another room. We were not perfect. We were never meant to be perfect. He was stubborn in ways that made me roll my eyes, and I was sensitive in ways that made him soften without realizing it. We balanced each other like two halves of a conversation that never wanted to end. We met when I was young enough to believe love was something that only happened in stories. He was not extraordinary in the way people usually describe heroes. He was ordinary in appearance, quiet in public, slightly messy in his habits, and deeply thoughtful in ways he never advertised. But to me, he was the only person in a crowded world who made me feel seen instead of just noticed. Our marriage was simple. No grand celebrations that people remember for years. Just family, prayers, and that quiet moment when I looked at him and realized that I was no longer just my own person. I belonged somewhere now, with him. The first years passed like gentle seasons. We built a small home together, not with luxury, but with effort. Every plate we bought, every curtain we chose, every small corner we decorated carried a piece of our shared decisions. We argued sometimes about money, about responsibilities, about silly things like which color looked better on the walls. But even our arguments never felt like distance. They felt like we were still on the same side, just speaking different words. He worked hard. Too hard, I used to tell him. He would smile and say, "One day you will not have to worry about anything." And I believed him, not because he promised me a perfect life, but because he never said things he did not mean. We talked about children often, not in a rushed way, but like people who believed there was always more time. He wanted a son who would run in the courtyard and a daughter who would sit beside me and ask endless questions. I used to imagine their voices in our house. Sometimes, when I was alone, I would even practice names in my mind, smiling at thoughts I had not yet told him. But life has its own timing, and it does not align with human plans. The day everything changed did not look special at first. That is what I remember most painfully. There was no warning written in the sky, no feeling that something was about to break. He left for work that morning like any other morning. He adjusted his shirt, drank his tea quickly, kissed my forehead briefly, and told me he would be back by evening. I remember standing at the door watching him leave. That moment should have been ordinary. It should have dissolved into the rest of the day like thousands of other mornings before it. But it did not. That evening, he did not return. At first, I thought it was work. Delays happen. Meetings stretch. Phones go unanswered. I cooked dinner anyway, keeping it warm, telling myself he would come home hungry and laugh at how worried I had been for no reason. I even cleaned the house a little more carefully, like preparing for his arrival was the most important task in the world. But as the hours passed, something in the air began to change. When the phone finally rang, it was not his voice. It was a voice I did not recognize, speaking in a tone that felt too careful, too slow, as if each word was being chosen to avoid breaking something already fragile. I do not remember everything clearly after that. Some parts of grief are like broken glass in water. You see shapes, but you cannot hold them. I remember my hands going cold. I remember sitting down without realizing I was falling. I remember my mother-in-law crying before I even fully understood why. I remember asking questions that no one wanted to answer directly. And then I remember the sentence that ended my old life. An accident. After that, everything became movement without meaning. Hospital corridors, voices repeating themselves, people touching my shoulder and saying words like strength and patience and God's will, words that sounded distant, like they belonged to another language I no longer understood. I did not see him when I wanted to see him. I only saw him later, when silence had already decided everything for me. And even then, I could not accept that stillness could belong to him. They say grief comes in stages. For me, it came like waves that never stopped. First denial, then anger, then a hollow kind of disbelief that settled inside me like a permanent shadow. I kept expecting him to walk through the door again. Even when people told me to accept, some part of me kept waiting for the sound of his footsteps. The house changed after that, not physically, but in the way it felt. Empty spaces became louder. His side of the bed became an accusation of absence. His clothes stopped being normal objects and became reminders of a life that had suddenly stopped existing. And then came the visits. The first time I went to his grave, I did not want to go. My feet moved like they belonged to someone else. The road felt longer than it should have, like time itself was resisting the destination. When I arrived, I stood there for a long time without moving. A name carved in stone. That was all it was, just a name. But I knew it was not just anything. It was everything. I remember falling to my knees before I even realized I was falling. I remember speaking to him even though I knew there would be no answer. I remember telling him about small things, like I used to tell him at home, because I did not know how to stop pretending he was still somewhere nearby, listening. People stood behind me. I could feel their presence, their sadness, their pity. But grief is strangely private even when it is witnessed by others. No one can carry it with you. No one can take even a fraction of it away. After that day, I started going more often. At just 30, I was no longer building a future. I was visiting the place where mine had ended. Every morning that followed felt like a continuation of something unfinished. Friends visited less frequently over time. Life, for others, kept moving forward. Weddings were attended. Children were born. Jobs were changed. Conversations slowly stopped including his name. But I did not move forward. I moved in circles. My world became divided into two parts, before and after. Before was laughter, shared tea, dreams spoken aloud without fear. After was silence, routine, and the grave that waited for me at the end of every emotional road. Sometimes I would sit alone and try to remember his voice so clearly that it hurt. Sometimes I would speak to him in my mind, as if he might somehow hear the thoughts I no longer had the courage to say out loud in front of others. There were nights when I would wake up expecting him to be beside me, and for a split second, before reality returned, I would feel normal again. Then the truth would arrive like it always did, and I would lie awake staring at a ceiling that no longer felt like home. People often say time heals. I do not know if that is true. Time did not heal. I would sit there gripping the edge of the stone, my fingers pressing into the cold surface as if I could force the world to answer me through it. But the only response was silence. A silence so complete it almost felt alive. At home, people began to worry in quieter ways. My mother would look at me for longer than necessary, as if searching for something she feared was disappearing. She would suggest small things, going out, meeting relatives, visiting friends. I would nod, sometimes agree, but I rarely followed through. Because everywhere else felt temporary, only there felt permanent. One afternoon, a relative told me gently that I needed to think about life again. She said it carefully, like she was walking through glass. I remember staring at her without responding for a long time, not because I was angry, but because I did not understand what life she was referring to. The life I knew had ended. What remained was something that only resembled living. Still, I tried, in small ways, almost out of obligation to the people who still cared for me. I started walking in the evening sometimes, not far. Just enough to feel air that was not trapped inside memories. I noticed things I had not noticed before. Children playing in streets, couples arguing and laughing, shopkeepers closing their shutters while complaining about the day. Life was continuing everywhere, just not inside me. One evening, as I walked, I passed a place where Arslan and I used to buy tea together. It was not special to anyone else, but it had become part of our routine when we were married. We would sit there after long days and talk about nothing important. I remember laughing there once because he had spilled tea on his shirt and tried to pretend it was part of a plan. That evening, I stopped in front of it. The shop looked exactly the same. Same chairs, same smell of spices and boiling milk, same sounds of cups clinking. But I could not enter, because stepping inside would mean accepting that I was alone in a place that once belonged to two people. I stood there for a long time until someone passed by and I moved again, as if reality itself had gently pushed me forward. Nights were the hardest. During the day, I could distract myself with movement, with small tasks, with pretending I was functioning. But at night, there was no escape. Night did not ask anything of me except truth. And truth always returned to the same point. He was not coming back. I would lie awake and replay everything in my mind. Not just memories of him, but memories of the last day, searching endlessly for something I might have missed, something that could have changed the outcome if I had noticed it earlier. Grief does that. It turns love into investigation. I began to remember details with painful clarity. The way he tied his shoes, the way he checked the door twice before leaving, the way he smiled slightly when I reminded him to be careful. These details became both comfort and torture. Comfort, because they were proof he had existed in my life so vividly. Torture, because they made his absence feel even more impossible. Months passed like this. People slowly stopped visiting as frequently, not because they stopped caring, but because life demands attention elsewhere. I did not blame them. I understood, even if I could not follow. Only I remained fixed in place, orbiting the same loss. One day, I went to his grave earlier than usual. The sun was still low, the air cooler than the afternoon visits. The world felt softer, quieter. I remember sitting down and feeling something different that day. Not healing, not acceptance, something more subtle. Exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, but emotional exhaustion that had been building for a long time. Like carrying something heavy for so long that your body no longer remembers what it feels like to put it down. I spoke to him less that day. Instead, I just sat there quietly. And for the first time, I did not cry immediately. It surprised me, because I had believed tears were the only way I still had him with me. But that day, something else came instead. A strange stillness. Not peace exactly, but a pause in the constant breaking. As if my heart had briefly stopped fighting what it could not change. When I finally stood up to leave, I looked back at the stone for a long moment. I did not say goodbye. I never say goodbye. Because goodbye feels like an ending. And I was not ready to believe that even endings are permanent. As I walked back home, the sky had changed color slowly. The kind of change you only notice if you are not rushing. I realized then that the world does not stop for grief. It simply continues around it. And somewhere deep inside me, a quiet thought began to form. Not hope. Not acceptance. Just the faint realization that I was still here. And that meant something, even if I did not yet know what. That faint realization did not change my life immediately, but it began to sit quietly in the background of everything I did, like a small light that refused to go out even when I tried to ignore it. I did not understand it at first. For so long, I had believed that surviving meant holding on to pain tightly, as if letting go of it would mean letting go of him completely. But slowly, I started noticing something I had not allowed myself to see before. The pain was not love. It was the shape love had taken after loss. And holding it the same way forever was not bringing him closer. It was only keeping me further from myself. Still, I did not stop going to him. The grave remained my anchor, the only place where I felt honest, the only place where I did not have to pretend I was okay for the sake of others. But something subtle began to change in the way I sat there. Before, I would arrive with urgency, like I was running toward something that might disappear if I delayed even a little. I would speak quickly, emotionally, sometimes even desperately, as if my words could bridge the gap between life and death. Now, I started sitting longer in silence, not because I had less to say, but because I was starting to realize he could no longer respond, no matter how many words I gave him. And silence had its own kind of truth. One afternoon, I remember the wind was stronger than usual. It moved through the trees near the graveyard in a way that made everything feel slightly unsettled, slightly alive. I sat there watching leaves shift in patterns I could not predict. For the first time, I did not immediately speak. I just sat. And in that silence, memories began to come differently. Not as sharp wounds, but as scenes. I saw him laughing at something small I had said during breakfast. I saw him adjusting the sleeve of his shirt before work. I saw him standing at the door, pausing for half a second longer than usual that last morning. That pause had never meant anything to me before. Now I wondered if it should have. But even that thought did not bring anger anymore. It brought something softer, something I was not used to feeling. Sad understanding. Life does not announce its turning points. It hides them inside ordinary seconds. I realized I had spent so long trying to hold on to the moment after loss that I had stopped noticing the moments that were still living around me. When I returned home that day, I found a letter tucked among old papers. It was from him. I had read it before many times, but that day it felt different in my hands. His handwriting was slightly uneven in places, like he had written it quickly. It was not a grand letter, not poetic or dramatic, just simple words he had written one evening when we were still normal. He had written about small plans, about fixing the roof someday, about going on a trip when things were less busy, about wanting to grow old in a house that still had my laughter in it. I sat with that letter for a long time. And for the first time in a while, I did not cry immediately. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Guilt. Not for loving him, but for forgetting that he had also lived a life that was full of ordinary hopes, not just the final moment that destroyed everything. I had been living only inside the ending, not inside everything that came before it. That night I could not sleep, not because of grief, but because my mind was moving differently. It was not replaying the accident anymore. It was replaying life before it. I began to remember things I had not thought about in a long time. The way he used to argue with me about small things and then make me laugh until I forgot why I was upset. The way he would bring me tea without being asked. The way he would sit quietly when I was tired, just keeping me company without needing conversation. I had been so focused on the absence that I had slowly erased the presence. Days passed like this. Something inside me was shifting, but not in a dramatic way. There was no sudden healing, no magical acceptance. It was more like learning to breathe differently in the same space. I still visited him, but the visits started to change shape. I no longer arrived only with pain. Sometimes I arrived with memory, sometimes with silence, sometimes with questions I did not expect answers to. One morning, I found myself speaking less and listening more. Not because I believed I could hear him, but because I was finally hearing myself. There were moments when anger returned, especially when I saw others moving forward in ways I could not. Weddings, announcements, simple joys that felt distant from my reality. But even anger no longer consumed me the same way. It passed through me instead of settling inside me permanently. One evening, as I was leaving the graveyard, I noticed a small child running between the pathways, calling for someone. His voice echoed lightly through the space, innocent and unaware of the weight of silence surrounding him. For a moment, I watched him, and something inside me shifted again. Not pain this time. Recognition. Life was still continuing, in places I had stopped looking at. That night, I returned home and stood in front of the mirror longer than I had in months. I saw someone I recognized, but also someone I had neglected to see properly. My face was the same, but my eyes carried something different. Not just grief, but endurance. and beneath it, something quieter. Possibility. I did not know what that meant yet, but I no longer felt completely trapped inside the past. That realization frightened me more than sadness ever had. Because sadness had become familiar, expected, safe in its predictability. But change meant stepping into something I had avoided for a long time. Still, I did not turn away from it. In the following days, I started doing small things differently. I began cleaning the house with more attention, not as a ritual of survival, but as a way of slowly reclaiming space that had become frozen in time. I opened windows more often. I let sunlight enter rooms I had kept dim for too long. And each time I did something small like this, I felt a quiet resistance inside me soften slightly. Not disappear, just soften. One morning, I went to the grave later than usual. The sun was higher, the world louder. And yet, when I sat down, I did not feel the same weight I used to feel immediately. I still missed him. That had not changed. But something else was beginning to exist alongside that missing. I spoke to him that day, but differently. Not as someone trying to hold on desperately, but as someone trying to remember properly. I told him about the changes in me, even though I was not sure I understood them myself. I told him about the way silence had started to feel less like emptiness and more like space. And for the first time, I told him something I had not been able to say before. I am still here, and I do not know what comes next. As I left that day, I did not feel lighter, but I also did not feel as broken. It was something in between, something unfinished, something continuing. And without realizing it fully yet, I had taken my first step away from only surviving toward slowly learning how to exist again. After that day, nothing in my life changed loudly. There were no sudden decisions, no dramatic turning points that others might notice from the outside. But inside me, something continued to shift in a quiet, almost invisible way, like soil slowly settling after a storm long gone. I still woke up with his absence. That never left me, but the way I responded to it began to change. Before, absence used to crush me instantly. It would arrive like a heavy object dropping into my chest the moment I opened my eyes. Now, it came more like a memory knocking gently before entering. Still painful, still real, but no longer violent in the same way. I started noticing small differences in my reactions. When I passed places we used to go together, I no longer had to stop every time. Sometimes I could walk past without breaking down. Sometimes I could simply feel the memory and continue walking, as if carrying it instead of collapsing under it. It confused me at first, because part of me had believed that if I was not breaking, then I must be forgetting, and forgetting felt like betrayal. But I was beginning to learn something that did not come easily to me. Remembering and suffering do not have to be the same thing. One afternoon, I found myself cleaning the cupboard where his clothes were still kept. I had avoided it for a long time, not because I had forgotten it was there, but because opening it felt like opening a door I was not ready to face. That day, something inside me pushed me forward. I opened it slowly. The familiar smell reached me immediately. Not strong, not overwhelming, but enough to bring everything back in an instant. For a moment, I stood still, gripping the edge of the cupboard, expecting the same collapse I had always known. But it did not come the same way. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Clarity. I touched one of his shirts. The fabric was still the same. Time had not changed it, but I had changed. And for the first time, I allowed myself to see it not only as something that belonged to loss, but also as something that had once belonged to life. I folded it slowly. Not with urgency. Not with pain. But with something close to respect. As if I was acknowledging that what had ended was still meaningful, even if it no longer existed in the same form. That night, I sat alone longer than usual. The house was quiet, but not the same kind of silence I had known before. This silence felt less like emptiness and more like pause. A space between what was and what would come next. I thought about Arslan again, but differently. Not only as someone I had lost, but as someone I had shared time with, shared laughter, shared ordinary days that had once felt endless. I realized something that unsettled me slightly. I had been holding on to the moment he left so tightly that I had almost reduced his entire existence to that single moment. But he was more than that. He was mornings and evenings. He was arguments and forgiveness. He was routine and comfort. He was not only the ending. And I had slowly been forgetting the beginning. That realization made my chest tighten, but not in the same way grief used to. It felt more like awakening to something I had overlooked for too long. The next time I visited the grave, I brought something different with me. Not just pain, not just silence, but memories I had started to reconnect with. I sat down and began speaking, but my voice was steadier. Not because I felt less, but because I was no longer drowning in what I felt. I told him about things I had remembered recently, small details I had almost lost in the fog of grief. The way he used to tap his fingers lightly when he was thinking. The way he would look at me when I was pretending to be upset, but actually wanted to laugh. The way he would sit quietly beside me when words were not needed. As I spoke, I noticed something unusual. I was smiling slightly. It shocked me at first. The reflex of guilt almost followed immediately, but it did not take control like before. Instead, I paused, and I let the smile remain. Because I realized something important in that moment. Smiling at memory does not erase loss. It acknowledges love. And love, I was beginning to understand, was not meant to disappear just because life had changed shape. On my way back that day, I passed the same road I used to avoid, the one that reminded me too strongly of him, but instead of turning away, I continued walking. My steps felt uncertain, but they did not stop. As I walked, I noticed how the world did not change because of my grief. People were still moving. Conversations were still happening. Life was still unfolding in countless directions that had nothing to do with my pain. At first, that realization used to hurt me deeply. But now it felt different. Not like exclusion. More like perspective. I was part of a larger world that had not stopped, even when mine had. That evening, something small happened at home. I found myself rearranging a corner of the room. Nothing major, just shifting things slightly, creating space where there had been stillness for too long. As I worked, I realized I was not asking permission from memory anymore before making changes. That realization made my hands pause, because it meant something I was not fully ready to name yet. I was beginning to live in the present again. Not instead of him, but alongside his memory. The two were no longer fighting for space in the same way. They were beginning to coexist. Still, I did not fully trust this shift. Because grief had taught me that change could be fragile, that progress could dissolve overnight, that a single memory could pull everything back into collapse. So I remained careful, cautious with my own healing, as if even healing could be dangerous if handled too quickly. A few days later, I visited his grave again. The sky was overcast that day, the air softer. I sat there longer than usual without speaking at first. Then I said something I had never said before. I am trying. Not to forget you. Not to leave you behind. But to live without breaking every time I remember you. The words felt strange leaving my mouth. Not heavy, not light, just true. And for the first time, I did not wait for silence to respond like it used to. I simply let it be. When I stood up to leave, I looked at the stone again, but my gaze was steadier than before. There was still pain. There would always be pain. But it no longer defined the entire shape of my existence. As I walked away, I realized something quietly forming inside me. Not happiness. Not closure. But something softer. The beginning of balance. And even though I did not fully trust it yet, I continued walking forward anyway. The balance I had begun to feel did not stay steady all the time. It came and went like light through clouds, sometimes visible, sometimes completely hidden, but always there in some form beneath everything else. There were days when I would wake up and feel almost normal for a few seconds longer than before. And then there were days when the weight returned with full force, as if reminding me that nothing about loss ever truly disappears. But something had changed in me that I could not ignore anymore. I no longer collapsed every time I remembered him. I still missed him deeply, so deeply that sometimes it felt like my chest would tighten just from a single thought. But now, that missing had become something I could carry instead of something that crushed me instantly. And that made all the difference in how I lived each day. I began to notice time again. Not as something I was stuck inside, but something that was moving forward around me. Seasons shifted without me resisting them as much. The air changed from cold to warm, from heavy to light, and I found myself acknowledging those changes instead of remaining frozen in my own inner season of grief. One morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The sunlight was soft, filtering through the curtains in a way that made the room look unfamiliar for a moment. I sat there quietly, not rushing to fill the silence with memories. And in that stillness, I realized something unexpected. I was no longer waiting for the day to end, just so I could visit his grave. That thought made me pause. Because for so long, my entire structure of days had been built around that single act. Everything led to it. Everything returned from it. It was the axis around which my life rotated. But now, the axis was no longer the only center. It was still important, but not exclusive. That morning, I did something I had not done in a long time. I made breakfast properly. I sat down and ate without distraction. I did not rush through it just to move on to the next moment of grief. It felt strange at first, like I was doing something I had forgotten how to do correctly. But I continued anyway. Later that day, I went to the graveyard, as I still did. That part of my life had not disappeared. I did not want it to disappear. It was still the place where I felt closest to him, even if that closeness had changed in nature. When I arrived, I noticed the surroundings more clearly than I used to. The small details, the texture of the ground, the movement of leaves, the distant sound of life continuing outside the walls. I sat down and did not speak immediately. Instead, I let myself breathe in the space between thoughts. And then I spoke, but differently than before. I told him about my morning. Not as a story of pain, but as a simple sharing of life continuing. I told him I had eaten properly. I told him I had noticed the sunlight. I told him I had not rushed through the day. And as I spoke, I realized something quietly unsettling. I was no longer only speaking from loss. I was speaking from life again. That realization did not make me guilty. It made me thoughtful. Because for a long time, I had believed that staying in pain was the only way to remain connected to him. That if I softened, if I lived even slightly beyond grief, I would somehow lose him completely. But that day, I began to understand something different. He was not only in my pain. He was also in my memories. And memories did not require suffering to exist. On my way back home, I passed a group of women talking and laughing outside a small shop. Their voices were light, unburdened. I found myself slowing down without meaning to. For a moment, I just watched them. And I realized I was not jealous of their happiness. I was simply observing life that I had been distant from for a long time. When I reached home, I sat for a while without doing anything. No cleaning, no distraction, no attempts to escape into memory, just sitting. And in that sitting, something unusual happened. A thought formed gently, without force. What if I am allowed to live again? The question did not bring immediate answers. Instead, it brought fear. Because living again felt unfamiliar. And unfamiliar things are always frightening after long periods of emotional isolation. That night, I could not sleep easily. Not because of grief alone, but because my mind was shifting in ways I was not fully ready for. I kept thinking about the idea of moving forward, a phrase people had used around me many times before, I used to reject it completely. It felt like betrayal, like erasing him. But now, I was beginning to see that forward did not necessarily mean away. It could also mean with memory, with love, with what had been lived. The next few days continued like this. Small changes, subtle shifts, nothing dramatic enough for anyone else to notice, but significant enough for me to feel them deeply. I started speaking to people a little more than before. Not long conversations, not forced social changes, just small interactions that did not feel completely exhausting anymore. I also began noticing that I was thinking less about the exact moment of his death, and more about the moments we had shared while he was alive. This was perhaps the biggest change, because for so long, my mind had been trapped in the ending. Now it was slowly remembering the story. One afternoon, I found an old photo of us tucked between pages of a book. I had seen it before, but I had avoided looking at it properly. That day, I held it longer. We were both smiling, not perfectly posed, not carefully arranged, just a natural moment captured without awareness. I stared at it for a long time. And instead of breaking down immediately, I felt something different rise inside me. Warmth, followed closely by sadness. And then something softer still. Gratitude. That word surprised me the most, because I had not expected to ever associate gratitude with loss. But I realized I was grateful for the time that had existed before everything ended. Even if it was no longer present, it had been real, and something that real could not be erased by absence. That evening, when I went to visit him, I carried that feeling with me. I sat down and placed the photo gently beside me for a moment before putting it away again. And I spoke to him differently again. I told him I was remembering us more clearly now. Not only the ending, but everything before it. And I told him something I had not been able to say before without feeling like I was breaking something sacred. I am still learning how to live, but I am no longer only surviving. As I left that day, the sky had turned a soft shade that I used to associate with calm evenings. I walked slowly, not rushing away from the place as I once did. And for the first time in a long time, I did not feel like I was walking away from him. I felt like I was carrying him with me in a different way. Not as pain, but as memory that had finally begun to breathe again. The change inside me did not move in a straight line. It never did. Some days felt like progress, and then suddenly, without warning, I would feel as if I had been pulled backward into the very beginning again. That is something no one really explains about grief. It does not end its earlier stages. It revisits them. And when it returns, it does not ask whether you are ready. One morning, I woke up feeling unusually heavy. Not in the soft, manageable way I had started to understand, but in the old, crushing way that made even getting out of bed feel like a struggle. Nothing had happened the night before. No trigger I could identify. No dream I remembered. And yet, the absence felt louder again, as if it had returned with renewed force. For a moment, I lay still and wondered if everything I had begun to feel, those small steps forward, those moments of breathing again, had been temporary illusions. That fear came quickly. Because healing, when it is still fragile, always doubts itself. I sat up slowly, and the house greeted me in silence. But it was a different kind of silence than before. Not completely empty, but layered, like it now contained both past and present at once. I made tea without thinking much. My hands remembered the movement even when my mind did not fully want to participate. And as I held the cup, I realized something uncomfortable. I had started building a routine again. Not the old routine that revolved entirely around visiting him, but a new, uncertain one that was still forming. And with that realization came another thought. If I was building something again, did that mean I was moving away from him? That question stayed with me through the morning. Later that day, I went to the graveyard as usual. I had stopped questioning whether I should go. It was no longer a decision. It was simply part of me. But that day felt different from the moment I arrived. I sat down, and for a while I could not speak. Not because I had nothing to say, but because something inside me felt conflicted. I missed him. That was not new. But today, the missing felt tangled with something else I did not immediately understand. I finally spoke, but my voice was quieter than before. I told him I was confused, that I did not know how to move forward without feeling like I was leaving him behind. The words came slowly, as if I was speaking from a place I had avoided opening for a long time. And then I stopped talking. I just sat there. The wind moved gently around me, but inside I felt unsettled. For the first time in a while, the grave did not immediately bring me comfort. It brought reflection. And reflection, I was learning, could sometimes hurt in different ways. On my way back, I passed a small gathering in the distance. People talking, laughing, moving through their day without pause. I watched for a moment longer than usual. And I noticed something unsettling again. I was no longer completely outside of life. But I also did not feel fully inside it yet. I was in between. And being in between is one of the hardest places to stand emotionally. That evening, my mother came to sit with me. She had been patient for a long time, more than I sometimes gave her credit for. But I could see something shifting in her too. Concern. Not the sharp kind that demands immediate change, but the tired kind that comes from watching someone remain stuck between worlds. She spoke gently at first, asking how I was eating, how I was sleeping, simple questions that carried deeper worries underneath. I answered politely, as I always did. But then she said something that stayed with me longer than I expected. "You are still young," she said softly. "You are allowed to live." I did not respond immediately, because the sentence sounded simple, but it carried a weight I was not prepared for. Allowed to live. As if I had been waiting for permission. As if I had not realized that somewhere along the way, I had begun to treat my own life like something paused indefinitely. After she left, I sat alone with that thought. Allowed to live. The words repeated themselves in my mind, uncomfortable and persistent. That night, I could not bring myself to visit memories the way I usually did. Instead, I sat with myself, without distraction, without speaking to the past. And I noticed something strange. When I stopped actively pulling myself into grief, grief did not disappear. But it also did not overwhelm me the same way. It simply existed alongside me, quieter when I did not feed it constantly. That realization was unsettling, because I had believed for so long that my connection to him required constant emotional pain. But now, I was beginning to suspect something different. That love did not require suffering to remain real. The next morning, I did something I had avoided for a long time. I went through old messages. Not recent memories, not painful moments, but ordinary conversations from before everything changed. I had avoided them because I feared what they would do to me. But that day, I let myself read them. At first, it hurt. Of course it hurt. But not in the way I expected. It did not destroy me. Instead, it reminded me of something I had been slowly forgetting. He was not only my loss. He was also my life. And that life had been full of small, ordinary moments that mattered just as much as the ending. I closed my phone after a while and sat in silence. And then I realized something I had not expected. I was not crying. Not because I felt nothing, but because something inside me was learning how to hold pain without drowning in it. That afternoon, when I went to see him, I spoke differently again. I told him I had read our old messages. I told him I had forgotten how normal we used to be. And I told him something that surprised even me as I said it. I am trying to remember you without disappearing into grief. The words felt honest. Not perfect. Not resolved. But honest. As I left, I noticed a small group of people near the entrance of the graveyard. One of them glanced at me briefly. I wondered what I must look like from the outside. A woman visiting too often, sitting too long, speaking to someone who no longer answers. I used to care deeply about that perception. Now I cared less. Not because I had stopped feeling, but because I was beginning to understand that grief does not need approval. On the way home, I noticed the sky again. I had started doing that more often. Noticing skis, noticing light, noticing time passing in ways I had ignored for a long time. And I realized something quietly powerful. I was no longer only living inside my memories. I was also beginning to notice the world again. That night, as I prepared to sleep, I felt something unfamiliar settle inside me. Not peace, not happiness, but a kind of acceptance that did not demand forgetting. It simply allowed me to exist as someone who had loved deeply, lost deeply, and was still learning how to continue. And for the first time, I did not feel like I was betraying him by breathing a little easier. I felt like I was slowly learning how to carry him in a way that did not require me to stop carrying myself too. After that night, something settled in me that I could not easily name. It was not stability, not peace, and not even confidence. It was more like a quiet awareness that I was no longer living in a completely unchanging emotional state. That realization itself felt like movement. Days began to pass with slightly less heaviness than before. Not because the grief had reduced, but because I had started to learn how to move alongside it instead of being constantly crushed beneath it. Still, life did not become easy. It simply became different. There were mornings when I would feel strangely normal again, and I would almost feel guilty for it, as if normality itself was something I had no right to experience anymore. That guilt would arrive quietly, questioning every small moment of calm. But I was beginning to notice something important. Guilt did not always deserve obedience. One afternoon, I received an invitation from a distant relative. A small gathering, nothing formal, just a family visit. In the past, I would have refused without hesitation. Crowds, conversations, questions, they all felt too heavy. But that day, I hesitated. And that hesitation surprised me more than the invitation itself. I told myself I would think about it. That was already different. In the evening, I went to the graveyard as usual. The path felt familiar beneath my feet, almost automatic now. When I reached him, I sat down and found myself speaking less than I used to. Not because I had less to say, but because I was starting to feel something I had not felt in a long time. Uncertainty about my own patterns. I told him about the invitation. I told him I did not know whether I should go, and then I stopped speaking and just sat there, watching the light slowly shift across the ground. For a long time, I waited for the familiar wave of emotional collapse that used to follow such thoughts. The feeling that I was abandoning him by even considering stepping into life again. But it did not come in the same intensity. Instead, what came was quieter. A question inside me. What would he have wanted for me? That question did not bring immediate comfort. It brought complexity. Because I realized I was no longer only grieving him as a loss, I was also beginning to remember him as someone who had once cared about my happiness. And that made everything harder in a different way. On my way home, I kept thinking about it. Not in a chaotic emotional spiral like before, but in a slow, repetitive way. As if my mind was carefully turning the thought over, examining it from different angles. That night, I told my mother I might go. She looked at me for a long moment, as if she was afraid to believe what she had heard. Then she simply nodded, carefully, as if even that small agreement was fragile. The day of the gathering arrived sooner than I expected. I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual that morning, not because I was trying to change how I looked, but because I was trying to recognize the person I was becoming. The reflection felt familiar, but also slightly distant, like someone I had not fully caught up with yet. When I left the house, I felt a strange tightness in my chest. Not panic exactly, but anticipation mixed with discomfort. I had not been in a social environment like this for a long time. The gathering was simple. People sitting together, talking, sharing food, exchanging updates about life. At first, I felt like an outsider, standing at the edge of something I no longer belonged to. Conversations flowed around me. Some people greeted me gently, with the careful softness people use when they know your life has been marked by loss. That softness used to make me feel fragile, almost exposed. But this time, I noticed something different. I did not break under it. I simply responded quietly. Not perfectly, not confidently, but present. There were moments when silence surrounded me, and I was no longer rushing to escape it. Instead, I let it exist. And in that silence, I realized something unexpected. I was not as invisible as I had believed. I was simply distant from this kind of world. A world that continued, without pausing for individual grief. At one point, someone asked me a simple question about daily life. I answered without overthinking. And when I finished speaking, I realized something small but significant. I had not mentioned him. Not because I had forgotten, but because for that brief moment, the conversation did not require his absence to define everything. That realization stayed with me longer than the conversation itself. When I returned home later that day, I felt exhausted in a different way. Not emotionally shattered like before, but mentally drained from being outside my usual emotional space. I sat down quietly, letting the silence of my house settle around me again. And then I noticed something else. The silence did not feel as suffocating as it used to. It still carried memories, still carried absence, but it no longer felt like it was the only thing existing in the room. That night, I did not go to the graveyard immediately. Instead, I waited. That was new. Waiting used to feel impossible for me. I used to rush there as if delay would somehow weaken my connection to him. But now, I understood something I had not understood before. Love is not measured by urgency. So I went later than usual. When I arrived, the atmosphere was different. Quieter, softer, more still. I sat down and for a long time I did not speak. I simply existed there. And in that stillness, I realized something painful but necessary. My grief had changed shape. It was no longer only sharp and consuming. It had become layered. Some layers were pain, some were memory, some were reflection, and some, I was beginning to realize, were slowly becoming acceptance. I spoke to him eventually, but not with urgency, not with desperation. I told him about the gathering. I told him I had gone. I told him I had survived it. And then I paused, because I realized something I had not expected to feel. I did not feel like I had betrayed him by going. That realization scared me slightly, because for so long, I had measured my loyalty to him through the depth of my suffering. But now, I was beginning to question that idea. As I sat there, I felt a quiet shift inside me again. Not dramatic, not sudden, but steady, like something inside me was learning to breathe differently. On the way back, I looked at the sky again. It had become something I noticed almost instinctively now. The colors were fading into evening tones, soft and uncertain. And I realized something simple but profound. My life was no longer only defined by where I went to remember him. It was also beginning to include where I went to live again. That thought did not erase the grief, but it expanded my understanding of what living with grief could mean. And for the first time, I did not feel like I was choosing between him and myself. I felt like I was slowly learning how to carry both memory and movement in the same life. After that evening, something inside me stopped feeling like it was constantly resisting life. Not completely, not permanently, but enough that I noticed it. There were still days when grief arrived without warning, pulling me back into depths I thought I had already learned how to climb out of. But even then, something had changed in the way I responded to it. I no longer saw those returns as failure. I began to see them as part of the process itself. One morning, I woke up and realized I had not dreamt of him the night before. That realization surprised me more than it should have. For a long time, he had been present even in my sleep, appearing in fragments, sometimes comforting, sometimes painful. That absence in dreams made me uneasy at first, as if I had lost him again, in another place. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, trying to understand what that meant. And slowly, I came to a realization that unsettled me in a different way. Maybe my mind was not erasing him. Maybe it was simply learning how to store him differently. I went through my morning slowly. There was no rush, no urgency pulling me toward grief immediately. And in that unfamiliar space, I found myself noticing details I had long ignored. The sound of water outside, the movement of air through the window, the quiet rhythm of life that had always been there, even when I could not feel it. Later, I went to the graveyard as always. But even that, as always, was beginning to feel less like a fixed obligation and more like a chosen ritual. When I sat down, I noticed something small. My hands were not trembling as much as they used to. It made me pause, because I had become so used to physical manifestations of grief that their reduction felt almost suspicious. I spoke to him, but softly. There was no urgency in my voice anymore, not because I had stopped missing him, but because the missing had changed shape. It was no longer a fire consuming everything around it. It had become a quiet ache that stayed with me, but did not burn everything it touched. I told him about the dreamless night. I told him about the strange feeling of waking up without his presence immediately flooding my mind. And as I spoke, I realized something. I was no longer narrating only pain. I was narrating change. That realization stayed with me longer than my words. On my way back, I passed a small group of children playing near a wall. Their laughter was loud, careless, completely unburdened by awareness of loss or time or permanence. I stopped for a moment without intending to, and I watched them, not with envy, but with recognition, because I realized something that surprised me. I had not heard laughter like that in myself for a very long time. Not because it had disappeared forever, but because I had not allowed space for it to exist. That thought did not immediately bring joy. It brought reflection. And reflection, I was learning, was its own kind of emotional turning point. When I reached home, I did not sit down immediately. Instead, I stood for a moment in the center of the room. And I noticed how the house no longer felt like it was only a container for grief. It felt like a space I was slowly returning to. Not fully, not completely, but partially. That afternoon, I received another invitation. This one smaller, simpler, a casual visit from a neighbor I had not spoken to properly in a long time. My first instinct was hesitation. But this time, the hesitation did not immediately turn into refusal. It turned into thought. And thought was already different from avoidance. I told myself I would decide later. That later itself was new. In the evening, I went to him again. The sky was softer that day, colors fading slowly as if the world itself was unwilling to rush into night. I sat down and found myself quieter than usual. Not because I had nothing to say, but because something inside me was asking me to listen differently. I told him about the invitation, about how I was still unsure, about how even small social decisions felt complicated when they intersected with memory. And then I stopped, because I realized something forming inside me again. Not clarity, not confusion, but awareness of my own hesitation. And that awareness made me uncomfortable in a way I was not used to. Because for a long time, I had believed hesitation meant loyalty to grief. But now, I was beginning to wonder if hesitation was simply fear of change. As I sat there, a thought came quietly. Was I afraid of leaving him behind? Or was I afraid of leaving the version of myself that only existed in grief? That question did not resolve anything, but it stayed with me. The next day, I accepted the invitation. It was a small visit, No pressure, no expectation, just a simple gathering of familiar faces. But for me, it felt like stepping into a slightly different version of my own life. When I arrived, I felt the old discomfort rise again, the sense of being slightly disconnected, slightly out of place. But this time, I did not immediately retreat inward. I stayed. The conversations were simple, ordinary. People talking about daily life, small updates, routine things that once felt meaningless to me because I had been living in something far heavier. At one point, someone mentioned something that made others laugh, and I found myself smiling slightly without forcing it. That moment passed quickly, but I noticed it. Because it was not the first time I had smiled recently, but it was the first time I had done so without immediately feeling like I had done something wrong. I left earlier than others, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was still adjusting to the feeling of being outside my emotional isolation. On the way home, I did not feel the same heaviness I used to feel after social interaction. Instead, I felt something more complex. Tiredness mixed with something unfamiliar. Engagement. That night, when I went to him, I told him about the visit. I did not hide it. I did not soften it. I simply shared it. And then I waited. Not for permission. Not for punishment. But for my own reaction. And I realized something slowly settling inside me again. I was no longer measuring my life only through grief. I was beginning to measure it through experience again. That realization did not remove sadness, but it placed it alongside other things. The following days continued in this new, uncertain rhythm. Some moments felt normal, some moments pulled me backward, but the distance between those extremes was slowly becoming more navigable. One afternoon, I found myself cleaning more deeply than usual, not as escape, not as distraction, but as attention to the space I was beginning to re-inhabit. As I worked, I noticed something unexpected. I was no longer avoiding certain areas of the house. Places that once felt emotionally frozen were beginning to feel accessible again. Not without memory, but without paralysis. That evening, I sat down and allowed myself to simply exist without planning my next emotional response. And in that quiet moment, I understood something that felt both simple and profound. I was not losing him by living. I was only learning how to stop losing myself while remembering him. What followed that realization was not peace. It was adjustment. And adjustment, I was learning, is never comfortable at the beginning. There were days when I felt like I was moving forward, and then suddenly I would wake up and feel pulled back into the old weight again, as if all the progress had simply paused overnight. But even those difficult days were no longer the same. They did not erase what had begun to grow inside me. They only reminded me that healing is not a straight road. It is something that bends, returns, and reshapes itself repeatedly. One morning, I woke up earlier than usual without any clear reason. The house was still quiet, the kind of quiet that feels untouched by the day's expectations. I sat for a while without moving, listening to that silence. And for the first time in a long while, I did not immediately think of grief. I thought of time, how it had moved without my permission, how I had moved inside it without realizing I was still moving at all. Later that day, I went to the graveyard as always, but something felt slightly different about the journey itself. The road no longer felt like an escape into sorrow. It felt like a place I was visiting as part of a larger life that was slowly expanding again. When I reached him, I noticed something I had not paid attention to before. The way I sat down had changed. Before, I used to collapse into silence as if my body itself was surrendering. Now, I sat more steadily, still emotional, still vulnerable, but no longer completely broken in posture. I spoke to him slowly, and I realized I was not only repeating memories anymore. I was reflecting on them. There is a difference I had not understood before. Memory says, this is what happened. Reflection says, this is what it meant. That shift changed the way I experienced everything. I told him about how I had started noticing life differently again. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but in small ways that I could not ignore anymore. The sound of people outside my immediate emotional world, the rhythm of days passing, the way my own breathing felt less trapped than before. And as I spoke, I paused, because I noticed something unexpected inside me. I was no longer speaking from only pain. I was speaking from awareness of change. That awareness made me quiet for a moment, because change always carries uncertainty. On my way back, I stopped briefly near a small tree that I had passed many times before but never really noticed. Its leaves moved gently in the wind, unaffected by anything I had ever felt. And I realized something quietly unsettling. The world had never paused for me, not even for a single moment. It had continued its rhythm, even when my life had stopped internally. At first, that realization used to feel painful, almost unfair. But now it felt different. Not comforting, but grounding, because it reminded me that I was still part of something larger than my grief. When I reached home, I did not immediately sit in silence as I used to. Instead, I found myself moving through the space more naturally, adjusting small things, opening windows, allowing air to enter places that had felt closed for too long. And in those actions, I noticed something important. I was no longer resisting the idea of change. I was participating in it. That evening, I received a message from someone I had not spoken to in a long time. An old acquaintance, checking in, asking how I was doing. In the past, I might have ignored it or responded briefly out of obligation. But this time, I paused before replying. Not because I was unsure how to respond, but because I was aware that my response came from a different version of myself than before. I replied simply, honestly, not hiding behind grief, not performing strength, just answering as I was. After sending it, I did not feel the usual wave of exhaustion that used to follow any interaction. Instead, I felt something quieter. Presence. That night, when I went to the graveyard, I found myself sitting for a long time before speaking. The sky was darker than usual, the air calm. And I realized something while sitting there. I was no longer only visiting him to escape the world. I was visiting him while also slowly returning to it. That realization made my chest tighten slightly, because it meant I was no longer only existing in one emotional space. I was beginning to exist in multiple layers at once. Memory, present, possibility. I spoke to him finally, but my voice was softer. I told him I was noticing things again. I told him I was changing, even if I did not fully understand the direction of that change yet. And then I said something I had never said before in this way. I am still here, but I am not only here in pain anymore. The words felt fragile as they left me, as if they might break something inside me. But nothing broke. Instead, something shifted. On the way back, I felt a different kind of silence around me. Not the suffocating silence of early grief, not even the reflective silence of adjustment, but something in between. A silence that allowed thought without drowning in it. When I reached home, I did not rush into distraction. I sat down and let the day settle. And in that stillness, I realized something that felt both simple and profound. I was no longer only surviving my memories. I was beginning to live alongside them, without disappearing inside them. And even though I did not fully trust this new balance yet, I could no longer deny that it existed. The realization that I was beginning to live alongside my memories instead of inside them did not bring immediate comfort. If anything, it brought uncertainty. Because for so long, my identity had been shaped entirely around grief that anything outside it felt unfamiliar. Almost like stepping into a version of myself I had not yet learned how to trust. There were still mornings when I would wake up and feel the old heaviness return without warning. And in those moments, I would wonder if everything I had started to feel was only temporary. But something important had changed, even in those moments. I no longer believed that one bad day erased all progress. One morning, I woke up to rain. Soft, steady rain tapping against the windows, filling the house with a quiet rhythm. For a while, I just lay there listening. In the past, rain used to intensify my sadness. It would deepen everything I was already feeling, making memories heavier, making silence sharper. But that morning, I noticed something different. The rain did not feel like an echo of grief. It felt like weather. Just weather. That thought surprised me. Because it meant I was beginning to separate my emotions from everything around me less instinctively. I still felt sadness, of course. It never truly left. But it was no longer automatically attached to every external detail of the world. Later that day, I went to the graveyard as usual. The path was slightly wet, the air fresh in a way that made everything feel temporarily new. When I sat down, I noticed how natural the act had become. Not routine in a mechanical sense, but familiar in a grounding way. I spoke to him, but I did not rush through my words. I told him about the rain. I told him how it no longer pulled me into immediate emotional collapse. And as I spoke, I realized something quietly unsettling again. I was no longer reporting only sorrow. I was reporting change. That awareness lingered in me. After sitting for a long time in silence, I found myself thinking about something I had avoided for years. My future. Not the distant, imagined version I used to talk about when I was younger, but the real, uncertain future that existed now. One that no longer included him physically, but still carried his memory within it. The word future used to feel impossible. Now it felt complicated. Not fully open, not fully closed. Just uncertain. On my way back, I noticed something small that I would have normally ignored. A shop reopening after rain, people moving carefully through puddles, life adjusting itself without hesitation. And I realized something quietly profound. Life was always adjusting, even when I was not. That evening, I received another invitation. This time not a social obligation, but a suggestion from someone who had known me before everything changed. A simple invitation to go out for tea. I did not answer immediately, but I also did not reject it instantly. That alone was a shift. I sat with the message for a long time, and I noticed my thoughts were not as extreme as they used to be. I was not immediately overwhelmed by fear, nor was I immediately pulled into avoidance. Instead, I was thinking, evaluating, feeling. That itself was new. Eventually, I replied that I would consider it. Not a yes, not a no, just space. That night, when I went to him, I told him about the invitation. And I noticed something different in how I spoke. There was no urgency in my voice, no desperation, no fear of betrayal. Just honesty. I told him I was still learning how to exist in both memory and movement at the same time. And then I paused, because I realized something important forming inside me again. I was no longer asking permission from grief to live. I was beginning to make decisions while still carrying grief. That distinction felt small, but it was not. As I sat there, I felt the familiar ache of missing him, but it did not expand into collapse. It stayed contained, present, real, but no longer consuming everything. On the way back, I looked at the sky again. I had started doing that often without realizing it. It had become a habit of noticing the world instead of only turning inward. And I realized something quietly powerful. I was not becoming someone who no longer grieved. I was becoming someone who could grieve without disappearing. When I reached home, I did not feel the need to immediately process everything emotionally. I simply sat down and let the day exist as it was. And in that moment, I understood something that felt both simple and life-altering. I was not leaving him behind by living. I was learning how to carry him without losing myself in the process. And for the first time, that idea did not feel like betrayal. It felt like survival turning slowly into life again. After that realization settled inside me, something quieter began to happen in my days. Not transformation, not healing in the dramatic sense people often imagine, but continuity. A slow, steady continuity that did not demand attention, but still changed everything. I still went to him. That never stopped. But the way I went began to feel less like escape and more like connection that no longer required suffering to prove its existence. There were mornings when I would sit at home and not immediately feel pulled into grief. That used to be unthinkable. Now it happened occasionally, unexpectedly, like brief openings in a long, closed door. And instead of fearing those openings, I began to notice them. One morning, I found myself standing near the window longer than usual. The light outside was softer, filtered through thin clouds. I realized I was not thinking about loss in that moment. I was simply observing. That realization made me pause. Because for so long, even my quietest moments had been filled with memory. And now there were seconds, small, fragile seconds, where I was simply present. Not detached. Not healed. Just present. Later that day, I went to the graveyard. The path felt familiar, but not heavy in the same way anymore. I still felt the emotional pull as I approached, but it was no longer overwhelming before I even arrived. When I sat down, I noticed how my body had started to remember a calmer rhythm. I no longer arrived in emotional collapse. I arrived in reflection. I spoke to him slowly. And I told him something I had been avoiding saying directly. That I was afraid of forgetting him in the wrong way. Not forgetting his existence, but forgetting the emotional weight that had defined my connection to him for so long. Because part of me had started to realize something uncomfortable. If I healed too much, would I lose him? That question had lived inside me quietly for days. I finally said it aloud. And then I stopped speaking, because I wanted to hear what silence would do with that fear. And nothing dramatic happened. No collapse. No punishment. Just stillness. That stillness taught me something I had not understood before. Silence does not always mean loss. Sometimes it simply means there is nothing more to destroy in that moment. On my way back, I passed a small roadside vendor I had walked past many times before. But this time, I slowed down. Not because I needed anything, but because I was noticing more again. I realized I had started observing life instead of avoiding it. That shift was subtle, but important. When I reached home, I received another message. A casual invitation to step out again. Nothing significant, just everyday life trying to re-enter mine gently. And I noticed my reaction was different again. I did not feel immediate resistance. I did not feel immediate acceptance either. I felt consideration. That in itself was a change I could not ignore. I agreed to go, but with hesitation still present. And for the first time, I did not feel guilty for that hesitation. The evening out was simple, nothing extraordinary, just sitting, listening, talking in small fragments, existing among people without the need to constantly justify my presence or my silence. At first, I felt slightly distant, like I was observing my own participation from outside myself. But gradually, that distance reduced. Not disappeared. Reduced. And I realized something important. I was no longer forcing myself to belong. I was allowing myself to slowly re-enter. When I returned home that night, I felt tired in a balanced way. Not emotionally shattered, not numb, just tired in the way a person feels after returning to something they had stepped away from for a long time. Before sleeping, I sat quietly for a while. And I noticed something I had not noticed before. I had not thought about the exact moment of his death all day. That realization surprised me. Not because I had stopped loving him, but because my mind was no longer trapped in the same singular moment. It was beginning to hold a wider timeline again. before, after, and everything in between. The next morning, I went to him again, and I spoke to him differently. I told him about the day before. I told him I had gone out again. I told him I had not broken. I told him I had returned. And then I paused, because I realized something quietly forming inside me. I was beginning to trust myself again. Not fully, not permanently, but in fragments. And that was enough to feel unfamiliar. As I sat there, I felt the familiar ache of missing him. But this time, it did not erase everything else. It existed alongside it. And that coexistence, however fragile, felt like the beginning of something I had not known how to name before. Not moving on, not letting go, but continuing. On my way back, I looked at the world differently again. The same streets, the same sounds, the same people. But I was no longer only a visitor in my own life. I was slowly returning to it. And even though I still carried grief with me every step of the way, I was no longer disappearing inside it. I was learning, moment by moment, how to remain myself within it. By the time I reached what I once thought would be the end of grief, I understood something important. There is no end, only change in how it lives inside you. My life did not return to what it was before him. That version of me no longer existed, and I finally stopped expecting her to come back. Instead, I learned to live as someone who had been shaped by both love and loss at the same time. Some mornings still arrived heavy. Some memories still cut through me without warning. And there were still moments, quiet, sudden moments, when I would feel his absence so clearly that I had to pause whatever I was doing. But those moments no longer destroyed the rest of my day. They passed through me, like waves instead of storms. And I stayed standing. I still visited him. That part of my life never stopped. But something inside those visits had changed completely. I no longer went only to mourn. I went to remember, to speak, to sit, to exist near a place that held a chapter of my life I would never stop carrying. One afternoon, I arrived and simply sat in silence longer than usual. No urgent thoughts, no emotional collapse waiting to happen, just quiet presence. And in that silence, I realized something I had avoided admitting for a long time. I was not stuck anymore. I was simply different now. I spoke to him gently that day. Not as someone trying to hold on desperately. Not as someone trying to let go. But as someone learning how to live with what cannot be undone. I told him I still missed him. That I probably always would. But I also told him something I had never been able to say before without fear. That I was living again. Not instead of him. But with him as part of my memory, not my prison. As I stood up to leave that day, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not closure. Not finality. But quiet acceptance that did not demand forgetting. On the way back, I looked at everything around me differently one last time. The road, the sky, the movement of life continuing without waiting for anyone. And I realized something simple, but deeply true. Life had never stopped for my grief. It had only asked me, again and again, whether I would continue with it. And now, after everything, I was finally beginning to answer. Yes. Not loudly. Not completely healed. But still here. Still walking. Still carrying love that had changed form, but not disappeared. At just 30, I had once believed my life had ended the day I became a widow. Now I understood something quieter and far more complex. That life does not always end where we think it does. Sometimes it breaks. Sometimes it pauses. And sometimes it slowly learns how to continue in a different shape. And so did I.